Jackie.
Hi.
Hi. Did you have anybody email you saying they wanted to participate?
Yeah, I think Linda Kuntz is on. I think she's going to share.
Oh, good,
And
good.
I have a story I can share. I'm going to go ahead and get the live stream started.
Okie doke. I'm going to mute myself.
Okay. All right. So we'll go ahead and get started here. Let me just get this going on our Facebook page. Hi, Linda, are you there? I thought I saw you logged in.
I saw her, Lisa.
Okay.
I guess she just can't hear you. She's on mute. I see her. She's on mute.
Okay. Let's see. Okay, we're going live.
Can you hear me now?
Hi, Linda. How are you?
Hi, I'm wonderful. Not very used to all this technology.
No. Well, it's kind of been a learning curve for all of us, so. Okay. I'm just setting the live stream up on Facebook. And let's see where we are. Okay. All right, so let's see. Got a few people here. All right, so welcome everybody. Nice to see all of you here. So as you know, this is the St. Louis Storytelling Festival, and I'm not sure if everybody logged on here or logged on via Facebook. We're streaming live now on Facebook. If you haven't heard of the festival, we've been around for 40 years. And we are a University of Missouri Extension program. We send storytellers out all over the St. Louis metro region to schools and libraries and performance venues. And it's usually the end of April and beginning of May. And of course, this year is a little bit different. We are going virtual this year. So this is our virtual 2020 St. Louis Storytelling Festival, and I'm pleased to welcome you here. So tonight is called a digital Decameron. And if you're all familiar with the literary work, the Decameron by Giovanni Boccaccio, that tells the story of some travelers in medieval Italy that were traveling, ironically, to escape the Great Plague that was happening in Europe at the time. And so this is kind of modeled after that. It's ironic that we also have a pandemic in the world right now, and there are some parallels. And so even though that's going on, that doesn't mean that we can't connect virtually. And so this is a chance for us to share stories. And of course, in that story, they traveled to escape the Great Plague, and they came together and shared stories, 10 stories for 10 days. And so that was the inspiration for having this weekly digital Decameron. And of course, we're doing it virtually. So I don't know how many of you would like to share a story. I think Linda has a story that she wants to share. So I think I will turn it over to you, Linda, if you'd like to go ahead and share a story. And can you give us the title of your piece?
Absolutely. The title of my story is The Pied Piper of Hamelin.
Okay, I'm going to type that into the chat box. And before you get started, Linda, just want to point out in the chat box over there, you can make some comments. I have an introductory message up there, and I have a feedback form if you'd like to fill that out afterwards. I'd love to get your feedback. And I'm going to go ahead and type the title of your story in there, Linda, and your name as well. Pied Piper of
Hamelin.
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 Okay, so this is Linda Kuntz, and I will go ahead and spotlight your video there so we can all see you. Okay, Linda, go ahead.
Hey, thank you. The Burgermeister was concerned. Now, typically, he was not concerned about what the villagers needed, but it had gone too far. Now it was affecting him. The town of Haviland was overrun with rats. Rats were everywhere. They were in the closets. They were under the bed. They were eating all the food. And they had tried everything that they could think of to get rid of the rats, but it hadn't worked. They'd tried trapping them, but the rats actually chewed through the traps. They had tried bringing in cats, but some of those rats were larger than the cats, and that did not work. They were thinking about perhaps poison, but they didn't want to hurt the children or the other animals. So the Burgermeister called the city council together and said, we've got to do something. Do you have any ideas? What could we possibly do to get rid of these rats? So the council decided they should send out town criers offering a reward to anyone who could help them get rid of the rats. And so they did. And people would come near and far, but everything they suggested did not work. The rats were overrunning the house. You could not pull back a blanket without a rat jumping out. You could not open a drawer or a cabinet, and they were eating all of their food. The villagers, the town of Haviland, was desperate. Then one day, a man appeared, a stranger to those parts, that had heard about the offer of the reward. And he said, I'm a piper, and I can help you. Well, the Burgermeister looked him up and down and said, how could you help us? And so the piper said, let me show you. He put his pipe to his lips and he played the sweetest song. The babies stopped crying. The children stopped quarreling. The men and women started smiling at each other. And the Burgermeister said, well, how was that possibly going to help us? Oh, one moment, said the piper. Let me give you another example. He put the pipe to his lips and he played. They couldn't hear anything. There was no sound coming out of the pipes, but suddenly all of the dogs from the town come running to the city hall and sat at the piper's feet. Oh, said the Burgermeister, perhaps you can help us. And so they negotiated a price. So the Burgermeister offered the piper a price if he would get rid of all of the rats in Haviland. And the piper agreed. It was a fair price. The next day, dressed in his black and white outfit, his hat with his feather and his cap, he went down to the city fountain, the city square, and he started playing an interesting song as he walked around the fountain 3 times. And as he was walking, the rats started coming from all the houses. The rats started coming from all the closets, the food bins, everywhere, and following the piper. The piper went around the fountain 3 times. And then he led the rats out of town to a river, and the rats jumped in and drowned. The piper had succeeded. The next day, the piper appeared in front of the Burgermeister and the city council and demanded his payment. He had succeeded in ridding the town of all the rats. It was now time to pay the piper. But the Burgermeister, he was greedy and dishonest. So he wanted to trick the piper and said, well, what proof do we have that you have killed those rats? What proof do we have that it was you who got rid of the rats? How many rats were there? How many did you kill? Do you have their dead bodies? Do you have their tails? We need proof. Give us proof. We will give you your payment. Well, the piper realized he had no proof. He had led the rats away and they drowned. And Burgermeister was firm. No proof, no payment. The piper was furious. And as he stormed out, he turned and he said, you will be sorry. You will regret the day that you did not pay the piper. And he left. The Burgermeister rubbed his hands and laughed, and he slipped the money into his pocket, thinking that was that. Well, the next day, the piper returned, and this time he was dressed in gaily bright-colored clothes, and again, a feather in his hat, and he walked down to the city square. And as he walked around the fountain, he played a lively song, and the children stopped to listen. They put down their toys. They ran to join him, laughing and dancing as he walked around the square and around the fountain 3 times. And then he led the children away from the village toward the mountains. And he led them to a cave, a cliff in the mountains. And one by one, the children disappeared. But not all of the children. Fritz had a hearing problem, and he could not hear the music. Thus, he did not follow the children. And Anna had hurt her foot, and try as she may, she could not keep up with the other children. Oh, she ran as fast as she could, but could not reach them. And when she got to the mountain, searching for the cleft in the rocks, she could not find it. Thus, Anna, she was the one that went home and told everyone what had happened. And the villagers were furious with the burgomaster. What? What? You have sold our children? You have sold our future for refusing to pay the piper. And that is the story, the Pied Piper of Hamelin. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. That was great. You know, I guess with the rats, that at the time of the plague, that was certainly a big concern, wasn't it?
It was, except at that time they didn't realize that the rats carried the plague.
Right, right.
More concerned that the rats were eating them out of house and home, literally.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, thank you. That was a great story. Thank you for sharing that. Okay. Is there anybody else that would like to share a story that's on right now? If not, I have a short story I can share. And let's see. Okay. So my name is Lisa, and I direct the St. Louis Storytelling Festival. And the story that I'm going to share is a story that's called The Trout. And it's a short story. And it's the reason why I wanted to tell this story is because I think it's a charming little story. I think there's a message of kind of childish innocence and hope, and a belief in the power of stories and magic and that kind of thing. And it also, to some degree, is a story about sibling connection between siblings and the love between siblings, and, you know, the typical kind of nature of the relationship between siblings, which can sometimes be a love-hate relationship. And the reason I wanted to tell that is because my sister, who is in Denver, has been going through some rough times with this whole coronavirus crisis. And I'm thinking a lot about her. She's a doctor and she's sort of on the front lines. And so I'm going to go ahead and dedicate this to her during this time. So without further ado, this is a story called The Trout. It is a short story, and it's by Sean O'Phelan. I'm not sure I'm saying that correctly, but that's the author of the story, and it's called The Trout. So without further ado, this is The Trout. So, it was known as the Dark Walk, and it always was Julia's favorite place to go to when they arrived at the summer cottage in the beautiful Irish countryside. It was a laurel walk lined with trees on either side, forming a bright, dark, moonlit canopy, with the leaves stretching out to reach each other and touching at the top. And underfoot was a carpet of brown leaves, dried but always with just a hint of dampness. It was her favorite place to go. It made her feel like a child again. And when she went there, and she arrived at the countryside and to the cottage, the first place she always went was to the walk, and she would rush in. And as the warmth of the sun left her shoulders behind, She would enter into the dark walk, and the darkness would embrace her, and she would get just a little bit scared, and her heart would start racing. And she would run through until she could see the light at the end of the tunnel, and she was once again embracing the warmth of the sun. Well, this year, she was able to take her little brother with her, and they had a grand time. They went back and forth, running from one end to the other, being scared and then laughing, and then being scared and laughing, and they would take turns. And they would try to see who could get through the fastest and be the most brave as they went through. And they went back and forth. And inevitably, it always came to an argument. He boasted, she mocked, and they squabbled. Well, crybaby. Well, don't call me a crybaby. You were scared too. You know you were, so there. Well, I'm not going to take you anymore. Well, I'm not going to go with you anymore, you big fat pig. Well, I hate you. Well, I hate you. And just as tears were starting to well up into that poor little distressed face, the mother knew she had to do something. So she asked, have you heard about the well? And at that, Julia's ears perked up, and she turned her head to look at her mom, revealing her long, graceful neck. And she asked, the well? She had never heard of the well, and she had been through the dark walk many, many times. And she knew enough. She was 12 years old now. She knew not to believe all those stories that her mom and older people were telling her, stories about Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny and the stork. And she decided to be incredulous. She said, I've never heard of the well, and I've been through many times. That's nonsense. But deep down inside, she was a little bit curious. So one day, after everybody had left, she went back into the well, into the dark walk, looking for this well. And she looked right and left, and she looked around, and there on the right, carved into the face of the stone, was a little cavern, and it was filled with just a little bit of water. And she looked, and it was shrouded by ferns and covered with leaves, and she pulled that away, and she looked closer, and she thought she perceived a little sound of breathing. And then suddenly she saw it, a little fish trapped in that little well of water. And she saw that it was trying to breathe in and out, in and out. She got so excited. She didn't know it was there this whole time. How did it get there? And how is it surviving? There was just barely enough water for it to turn around. And she got so excited, and she went back and got her brother, and she grabbed him, and they looked at it, and they thought, how could it get here? And so for the next few days, they went back and forth and played with it and didn't know what to do. They couldn't save it. They didn't have anywhere to put it. They were afraid to kill it. And so they got excited, and they went back to their mom and dad, and of course their mom and dad had stories. Her mom said for sure that a bird had picked it up in its beak, and while it was flying, it had probably dropped it, and it landed in that little well of water. And her dad thought that for sure the little baby trout came down from a stream from the hills up above as a little baby trout, and it got trapped in there. And then when the sun came and dried the water up, it had left just a little bit of water and trapped that little trout into its little watery prison. Well, she got very concerned about the trout, and she was concerned. How did it eat? What did it eat? And she looked at it again, and it was still just trying to breathe in and out. She's so concerned about it. So she went around looking for food, and she dug up a little tiny worm, and she pulled it, and she laid it next to the trout. But the trout didn't care about eating. It just had to focus on trying to breathe in its little watery prison. And she could see its little gills just moving slightly up and down, trying to survive and breathe. So one night in late June, it was exceptionally hot, and she lay in bed pondering the fate of that little trout. And she was so concerned about it. Why, they had been in school all year long, and had that trout been there the whole time? How could it have survived that whole time? She thought about it, and she kept looking up at the moon through her window. It was well past 10 o'clock, but it was so warm out that she lay her spindly legs, threw them across the edge of the bed, and she had one sheet pulled lightly up across her. And her mom came in to read them a bedtime story. But she started off telling a story about that trout again. Now, Mama and Papa Trout were really upset with the baby trout, she said, because the little baby trout wasn't listening to Mama Trout and Papa Trout. It was being naughty. And so as the trout got bigger and bigger, the water got smaller and smaller. Julia heard this and she said, "No, don't tell that kind of a story. The trout didn't do anything wrong. Don't tell that kind of a moral story." And she got upset and she flipped around and she pulled the sheet up even close to her. She said, "Nonsense." And the mom saw that Julia was upset, so she changed the story. She said, but there was a fairy godmother, and the fairy godmother made it rain, and it rained so much that it filled the well up with water. And there was so much water in the well now that the trout could now swim out, and it could float down to the river and join the rest of its friends in the flowing river, and it was freed. Julia listened to this defiantly, and she turned around even more and pulled the sheets up even tighter, and she said, "There's no such thing as a fairy godmother." And she became even more distressed as her mom turned the lights out and left the room, for she knew the reality of the situation. There was nothing to save the poor little trout. It was out there all by itself, and she couldn't help but thinking, how was that trout going to survive? And then all of a sudden, she heard a little whizzing sound. Zzz. And she shot up in her bed and she realized, the fishermen, the night fishermen there, what if they fished that little trout out? How is it going to survive? What if they ate it? And she got so panicked and so worried about that little trout, she threw the sheet off and she looked at her little brother, but her little brother was useless. He was just a hot pile of sweating flesh. He wasn't doing anything. He was fast asleep, but she knew she had to do something. And so she jumped up and she grabbed a pail and she crawled out the window. And even though it was dark, she went over to that dark walk with pail in hand. And she was frantically searching for that little trout. And she searched and she searched and she saw the little pile of water. And she pushed the leaves back and she grabbed in and she reached for the trout, and the trout was scared. It didn't know what was going on. So it flip-flopped against the back of her hand and tried to escape. And she said, "No, little trout, I'm trying to save you." And so she grabbed the trout and she threw it into the pail, and she knew what she had to do. She ran out, even though she was afraid, to the end of the dark walk. And she even started going down to the river, and the stones on the side of the slope were cutting into the bottoms of her feet because, of course, she was barefoot. She was only in a slip of a nightgown. And she grabbed the pail, and as the stones were tearing her feet apart, she walked down to the edge of the water, and she took the pail, and she dumped it, and it went plop. And the trout dropped into the river. And she looked, and for a moment she could see the trout, until she didn't. And it disappeared, so that all she could see were the moon mice dancing on the surface of the water. She took a deep breath, and eventually she relaxed. And eventually she even smiled and she giggled and she hugged herself. She picked up the pail. She walked back up the slope. She didn't care about the rocks that were tearing her feet apart, and she walked all the way through the dark walk and back up to the house, and she crawled back in through the window and set the pail down, and she slept well that night. Until the next morning when her little brother awoke her. He was frantic and he said, Julia, I don't know what happened with the trout. It was there yesterday. I know it was. You and I saw it, and it's just not there, and I don't know where it could have gone, and I don't know where, and I don't know how, and I don't know." And Julia just looked at him, and she smiled, and she raised her little face, and she said, I don't know. Fairy godmother, I suppose. And then she turned around and walked away. And that's the story of the trout. So that was, again, I like that story because it's kind of a story of siblings, how they can sort of have a rivalry and still really look out after each other. And I think it's a beautiful little tale. So would anyone else, I'll put the title of that story into the chat room too here. Would anyone else like to share a story? I think we have a couple more people that have joined us. If anyone wants to raise your hand, or you can unmute yourself and share a story. If not, let me ask everybody, how are you doing in this time of social distancing? How's everybody doing? You can put something in the chat or you can unmute yourself. Doing okay? Strange times, I know. But hey, we're gonna be here. We're gonna be here every Friday night. Linda, did you want to say something?
Oh, I was just going to say, we have been social distancing. We typically have a full pantry. Food was not an issue. My husband works from home. I have been doing what I can, but we've been getting outside a couple of times a day and walking through the neighborhood. And we have seen children drawing in their driveways for art class. We have seen people dining, picnicking at the end of their driveway where they have ordered food from local businesses, and they're just raising their glass to their neighbors as they're 10, 20 feet apart. And we have seen more people out than we have ever seen living in this neighborhood for over 30 years. Typically, we would have a dog and we take the dog for a walk. The dog has since passed away, but it's been fun to see kids out riding their bikes and just being outside with their family. And everyone is just trying to do what they can.
It's nice to see when that happens, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing that, Linda. I live in a neighborhood, and I'm going to go ahead and put you so you're not in the spotlight there, Linda. Yeah, these are difficult times, but I know there's been some really heartwarming stories, and that's partly what this digital Decameron is for, is to share stories of strange things that have happened, of heartwarming things that have happened, of stories that you think are good metaphors for what's happening. And I'd like to reach out, in the Decameron, if you're not familiar with that story, again, it's a frame story. So there's a group of travelers and they're telling stories to each other, and they tell 10 stories. There's 10 travelers and they each tell a story on 10 days. So that ends up being 100 stories. And of course, the first day of stories, just as tonight, there was no real theme. People could tell whatever kind of stories they wanted to. And that was actually what happened in the Decameron. So there wasn't any theme to the first day. And after that, each day there was a theme to the stories. So I think what I'd like to do for next week, modeled after the Decameron, is to have a story, a theme, of quarantine. That's going to be the theme for next week, quarantine. So if you think of a story, if you have some experiences you'd like to share of being quarantined, of how you're coping with being quarantined, of interesting things that you've learned about yourself or about others being quarantined, or how you're communicating with others while you're being quarantined, I'd love to hear about it. Feel free to drop me a line if you'd like to share a story. It can be a true personal story. It can be a folk tale or a fairy tale. It can be whatever you want it to be. But I'll put that out so that next week we have a theme of quarantine. And that will be our proverbial second day of storytelling during this time of pandemic. And that will be our theme next week. So if you're joining us on Facebook and you'd like to share a story via this platform, make sure you drop me a line. Again, the organization hosting this is the St. Louis Storytelling Festival. We are a University of Missouri Extension program. And I'll put my email in here if you'd like to drop me a line. Or you can always go to our website, which is stlstorytellingfestival.com. Again, stlstorytellingfestival.com. And drop us a line there. There's a way to send a message to me, and it goes directly to me. You can let me know if you'd like to share a story. And next week, as I said, our theme will be quarantine. So unless anybody else has an experience or a story they'd like to share, I think I'll cut it short tonight. I know we have some listeners listening in from Facebook too. And everybody, I want to say thank you for coming. I do have a survey feedback form up there. If you'd like to click on that, it will take you directly to a form you can fill out to give some feedback. This is the first week of our virtual storytelling festival, and we adapted it very quickly to make it a virtual festival so that we could all connect and communicate, and would love to hear your feedback. We have some storytelling that's happening for kids during the day. Every Tuesday and Thursday, we have Schools Out Storytime. We have historical storytelling every Wednesday at 10 a.m. called Way Back Wednesdays. We have Thursday Later Tales for adults. And then, of course, Friday, we have kind of our open mic, which is what we have tonight. So I want to thank Linda. Thanks for sharing. And thanks, everybody, for joining on, either via Zoom or for Facebook. And we'll see you next week. Be well and be safe, and thank you again. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Lisa. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Linda.
Bye.
Bye, Mike.
I'm figuring it out.
Okay.